Good morning, teachers, and my name is Jacob Higuera from BSPT Pearson 1A, and this will be my final written demonstration for the end term regarding aquatic exercises. So my case is number 10. Stretch the right shoulder towards abduction and strengthen the right ankle invertors using aquatic exercises. So before we start, I will be instructing the patient to do simple warm-ups because we do not want to work with cold muscles even in the water. So we'll be doing arm circles for about 30 seconds to 1 minute, and then we'll be also arm circles for 30 seconds to 1 minute for the upper extremity, and for the lower extremity, we'll be doing marching in place for about 30 seconds to a minute also. So our plan of care for stretching the right shoulder towards abduction. Our patient position will be in a BS supine floating or buoyancy supported supine floating. So let's just assume that the patient right now is floating on top of the surface of the water, and we are looking at it from a bird's eye point of view. So the equipment that we will be using on the patient will be cervical collars, which will go around the neck, buoyancy belts, which will go around the waist of the patient, and then flotation rings, which will go on the distal upper and lower extremities of the patient, particularly on both the wrists and both the ankles. So the three muscles that we will be stretching with the movement will be the arm adductors, which are namely the latissimus dorsi, the teres major, and the coracobrachialis. Even if the coracobrachialis is a weak adductor, it still counts as an adductor nonetheless. So for our stretching parameters, we'll be holding a stretch force for about 15 seconds, and we'll be doing that for 6 repetitions. So the physical therapist position will be standing on the right side facing cephalad and hip in contact with the patient's hip. The hand placement of the therapist will be the fixed hand will be on the right scapula, the movement hand on the medial side of the elbow of the right arm, and the stretch force direction will be towards abduction. So based on the pic here, the yellow circle represents me as the physical therapist standing on the side of the patient, and we are looking at it again from a bird's eye point of view. So I will be facing towards the patient's head or cephalad, represented by the red arrow, and the blue circles will be points of contact with the patient. So my hip will be in contact with the patient's hip, represented by the small blue circle, and then my left hand will be grasping the medial aspect of the elbow of the right arm, represented by the big blue circle. So my fixed hand or my right hand will be under the patient, particularly on the under the right scapula for stabilizing this part to be able to effectively stretch the muscles that are attached to the scapula, the teres major, and then the coracobrachialis. And then, in order to also effectively stretch the latissimus dorsi, the point of contact with the hip will allow me to provide stabilization and also stretch the latissimus dorsi effectively. So as we are in position, the yellow arrow will be the direction of the stretch force. So as I hold the medial aspect of the right elbow of the patient, I will be directing it towards abduction, again represented by the yellow arrow. And next, for the plan of care for strengthening the right ankle invertors, we'll be using the same position of the patient in a buoyancy supported supine floating, again in a bird's eye point of view. And we will be using the same equipments, the cervical collars, the buoyancy belts, and the flotation rings. However, in order to perform the resistance exercise on the right ankle of the patient effectively, I will not be placing a flotation ring on the right ankle, but instead only in the left ankle because this may hinder the space between the ankle and my hand. So the three muscles that will be strengthened are the ankle invertors, namely the tibialis anterior, the extensor hallucis longus, and then the tibialis posterior, which are the ankle inverters again. So for the resistance parameters, we'll be doing this for 8 seconds of resistance hold for 10 repetitions of 2 sets. And the therapist position, I will be standing on the lateral side of the affected leg, the right leg, and I will be facing caudally or towards the foot of the patient. My hand placement will be my fixed hand will be on the lateral aspect of the affected leg, and my resistance hand on the dorsal medial aspect of the affected foot. And the resistance force direction that I will be applying will be towards eversion. So based on the picture here again, the yellow circle will be representing my position, my head on the bird's eye point of view, facing towards the foot, represented by the red arrow. And points of contact will be represented by the blue circles. My right hand will be grasping the area where the circle can be found in the shin area. And then my left hand, which is the resistance hand, will be found in contact with the foot on the dorsal medial aspect, represented by the blue circle on the foot area. So the resistance force represented by the yellow arrow that I will be applying to the patient will be towards eversion, and the patient will be moving his ankle towards inversion. So as the patient moves his ankle towards inversion, represented by the orange arrow, I will be resisting this movement by applying a resistance force represented by the yellow arrow going towards the opposite direction.
Question number one. In treating a patient who experiences pain near the end range of motion in his hip and knee, what temperature should you use during aquatic exercise? So, on assessing the question, I can see main issue here, which is the pain, and which will naturally cause the patient to have a range of motion limitation in that area, since it is a natural response that we will not do things that will cause us pain. So because pain and range of motion here is the issue, the temperature that we should use during the aquatic treatment of the patient based on the table should be about 37 to 41 degrees Celsius, so that we can address both issues at the same time. Side question number two. Upon checking the patient's chart, you found out that your patient has a history of epilepsy and has had seizures, but this was 3 years ago and no records or episodes since then. Can your patient participate in aquatic exercise, yes or no, and why? My answer to this is that yes, the patient is eligible for aquatic exercise. Generally, we see epilepsy or seizures as neurological disorders, and they may be considered as contraindications or precautions, since this requires close monitoring of the therapist to the patient, and if ever they have seizure, it creates a safety issue for both him, the PT, and the patient. But since it was 3 years ago, in the case of the question, it is okay for the patient to be participating in aquatic exercises. Side question number three. Differentiate BA or buoyancy assisted from BS buoyancy supported. So the main difference between the two is the direction in which the movement occurs. For buoyancy assisted, it is in the vertical direction, and buoyancy supported, it is in the horizontal direction. So buoyancy assisted, since the force of buoyancy is against gravity, meaning it goes upwards, movement that you do that is going upwards also, like for example elbow flexion, are easier to do, since you also get additional na force going upward from the buoyancy from the water. And buoyancy supported is when you do movements in more in the horizontal movement, such as horizontal abduction of the arm. And since in land we have to, when we perform movements, we hold up our limbs against gravity. In the water, buoyancy from the therapy pool will support our limbs, so that we don't have to exert as much effort to hold it up against gravity. And that was my final return demonstration for the BCS2 laboratory, finally done. Thank you, teachers.